This webinar is sponsored by the Maryland Institute for the Emergency Medical Services Systems and is brought to you through funding by the Maryland Department of Transportation. I coordinate the Child Passenger Safety Healthcare Program at MIMS, and I wanted to just give a couple housekeeping details before I introduce our speaker. You do have the option to use either your telephone or your computer mic and speakers. You will be on mute automatically if you're using your computer, but if you're using the telephone, you need to place your own phone on mute so that we don't have any background noise. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat pane of the control panel. After the webinar, you will be automatically sent a short evaluation. Please complete this as it's helpful for me planning future webinars. It's also required if you wish to get the CEU for your Child Passenger Safety Technician recertification. I will send you a certificate after the webinar. If you're sharing a computer and not individually registered, the evaluation form is also provided under the handout section. You can print it out and send it back to get a certificate. Now, let me introduce our speaker. Julie Mansfield is a research engineer at the Injury Biomechanics Research Center at The Ohio State University College of Medicine. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in mechanical engineering and is currently working on a PhD in biomedical engineering. Her specializations have led her to a career in researching injury mechanics and in particular child car seat safety. Julie hopes that her research on the use and performance of child restraint systems leads to the prevention of pediatric injuries. So now we're going to turn it back to Cindy, who will then turn it over to Julie.
Okay, great. Thank you thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you too for the introduction. Today we're going to be discussing some research and some crash testing and some general data pulled from the literature about all different types of crash dynamics. We're kind of going to hit a little bit on each type. So the first discussion point I want to talk about is rear-facing versus forward-facing CRSs. And this should be a topic that most CPSTs are familiar with, but we're just going to run through a little bit refresher and a few kind of visuals that we can use to help understand what's going on here and the difference between rear-facing and forward-facing CRSs. So we're all taught that rear-facing child restraint systems, or CRS, are the safest option for children until at least age 2 or beyond age 2 if the child still falls within the height and weight limits of their particular CRS. We know that rear-facing CRS protect the child's head, neck, and spine. And this is especially true in a frontal impact, where I think we can all kind of imagine that the head is cradled by the CRS and helps to keep the head, neck, and spine aligned. And I want to kind of distinguish a little bit further in this presentation when we talk about a frontal impact versus an impact that might happen from the side or from the rear of the vehicle. So I believe CPSTs are taught in the certification course that occupants inside the vehicle tend to move towards the location of the impact. So if the vehicle runs into something in the front, all those occupants are going to kind of move towards the front of the car. That's basic physics, right? An object at rest remains at rest, and an object in motion remains in motion. So you tend to move towards the point of impact. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we move through some of these videos. So the first video I have is going to show a forward-facing car seat on the left and a rear-facing car seat on the right. And both of these car seats are going to experience the same frontal impact. So I'll play it a couple times. But if here we have our vehicle, and here we have our forward-facing car seat versus our rear-facing car seat. Again, that impact is coming, let me see if I can pause it. Oops. Coming from the front of the vehicle, and so you can see that child occupant kind of being pulled forward. You can see that the rear-facing seat keeps the head, neck, and spine aligned, whereas the forward-facing seat allows that head to come forward because the harness is restraining the torso only, but the head and neck are not really protected in that scenario. If you're interested in seeing more about this video, it's from actually our group, our parent outreach group. We call it Buckle Up for Brutus. But if you go onto YouTube and just search Buckle Up with Brutus, you can see this video should come up for you, and it's got a little bit more description as well about what's going on there. So that scenario that we just played out was for a frontal impact. So one thing that we had a lot of questions on when we posted that video online and you can see some of the comments that people have posted below it. They said, well, that makes sense for a frontal impact, but what if the car is hit from behind? Wouldn't the opposite be true? So how can we say that, one orientation of car seat is safer than the other if we don't know what type of crash we're going to be in? And so that's the question that I want to focus a little bit on today. I want to talk not just about frontal impacts, which is mostly what we talk about, but I want to talk about side impacts and rear impacts in particular a little bit more in depth today. So the first thing I want to bring up is the frequency of different impact types by direction. So the data that we're looking at here is data from almost 6 million crashes compiled by NHTSA in 2014, and it's just showing the percentage of crashes as experienced by the occupants by direction. So we see that the most obvious thing here is that frontal impacts account for 53% of impacts. So if you think about it, this kind of makes sense because cars move forward, right? When we're on the road, cars are moving forward, and at least one vehicle in every crash is going to experience that crash as a frontal impact. So if you have, say if you have two cars in a head-on collision, both of those cars experience a frontal impact. If you have a car that's sitting at rest and gets struck from the side, well, that car that's doing the striking is going to experience a frontal impact, and the car that's sitting there and gets struck from the side would be categorized as a side impact. So you can see kind of from that perspective how this plays out. If we have a single car collision, if a car just runs off the road and runs into a tree, that would be a frontal impact with no side or rear impact involved. So kind of thinking about it this way, it makes sense that if we look at the numbers, frontal impacts are the most common. Cars move forward. So hopefully that makes sense. When we talk about side and rear impacts, then we're talking about the cars that are getting struck by other vehicles. And for those, the percentages break down to about 20% of people in crashes experience the side impact, and 25% would experience a rear impact where the car gets hit from behind. So if you're stopped at a stoplight and somebody rear ends you or something like that. And then there are some oddball cases too, what they classify as non-collision or other unknown. So this might be like a rollover or something like that. Those tend to be more rare. They do tend to cause injuries, but they tend to be more rare than the frontal side or rear impacts that we see here. So then I want to talk about the injuries by impact direction. So I know our group is mostly focused on children, and we want to learn about child injuries. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of data for that, so I want to start by looking at adult injuries. So these are percentages of adults who have been hospitalized after each type of crash. So again, we have frontal in blue, side in orange, and rear in green. These are data from 72,000 adult front row occupants. We're excluding rollovers from this because rollover crashes tend to be quite severe and cause quite a bit of injuries, but they're also very hard to categorize and to study because each one is so much different from another. So just looking at our main frontal side and rear impacts, we see a different distribution from what we saw on the previous slide. So even though frontal impacts are the most common, we see that they are not the highest percentage of injury-causing accidents. We see actually that side impacts cause the highest percentage of injuries, even though they're less common than frontal injuries or than frontal impacts. And then we see that rear impacts cause proportionally very few injuries compared to either frontal or side impacts. So if we think about this, this is what we mean when we say that side impacts cause a disproportionate number of injuries. They're not the most common type of crash, but they do cause the highest percentage of injuries. And this is also why in our field, we don't really hear people talking about rear impacts very often. You hear it sometimes in reference to like whiplash or something like that for adults. But in terms of child passenger safety, we don't really talk about rear impacts that much. And it's a question that parents sometimes ask me. It's a great question. It shows that they're thinking about crash dynamics. And I think a lot of times people think that we forgot about rear impacts and that we're not thinking about all the options, when the truth is that we are thinking about rear impacts. We have data from rear impacts, but they just aren't really causing injuries that often. And so, we don't want to focus our time and efforts on a crash mode that isn't a priority and isn't really causing injury. We want to focus on the most common type of crash, which is frontal, and also the most injurious type of crash, which is side impacts. And so that's why you don't hear about rear impacts very often. Again, they just aren't really causing the injuries that we tend to see in the other two types. That being said, though, the question has come up enough to me in my career as a CPST and as a researcher that we thought it deserved some special attention. So we developed this project where we took a special look at rear-facing CRS in rear impacts in particular, so that we help kind of explain to parents and to CPSTs exactly what's going on in this crash mode. So in this crash condition, we have a rear-facing child, and they are facing, obviously, the rear of the vehicle, and that is where the vehicle is being struck. So we have the child facing the point of impact, and we're going to kind of walk through what that might mean for a rear-facing occupant. So the first thing that a researcher typically does is to look at the literature, to look at papers that have been published, to look at data that other scientists have collected, and see what's already out there, see what we already know, and then what can we build on from there. So the first paper I want to look at comes from Sweden. Actually, it's from Jakobsen et al. Are the authors. It came out in 2005. They pulled a whole bunch of data from the Volvo crash database. So all kinds of crashes that Volvos were involved in, and this manufacturer is looking through to understand the injuries that are happening in their vehicles. Their data set includes 454 children in rear-facing CRSs, and they found that no rear-facing children suffered injuries more than AIS-1 in side or rear impacts. So AIS-1 would be a very minor injury. The stands for the abbreviated injury scale. It ranges from 0, which would be no injury, all the way to 6, which is a fatal injury. So an injury with a score of 1 would be very minor. It might be a bump or a bruise or a minor abrasion. And they found, at least in their somewhat small database, that no rear-facing children suffered more than these very minor injuries in either side or rear impacts. And they conclude that the rearward-facing child seats are designed primarily for frontal impacts, like we talked about. That's how they really cradle the head and neck. However, the outcome for side and rear end impacts indicates good performance also in these situations. Next, we're going to jump over to Germany real quickly. This is a study by Langbeiter et al. 1999, the Institute for Vehicle Safety, again in Germany. They had a smaller sample size, so they were only able to look at crashes involving 42 rear-facing children. And you see the table breaks down by type of crash. So we've got front, side, rear, and rollover, and total across the top. And then across the vertical axis, we have, again, this MAIS scale, so maximum AIS scale of 0 through 6, with 0 indicating no injury at all, 1 being minor injuries, and then all the way up into 3, 4, 5, 6 being the more severe injuries. And if we look at the column circled in red, you see that the rear-facing children in rear impacts suffered either no injuries at all or very minor injuries. So again, very small sample size. We're only looking at 9 kids who were in this particular group. But the authors conclude, hence rearward-facing infant carriers have a low risk of injury in rear-end collisions. So that's pretty much all the data we could find from actual children and actual crashes. We don't really have a whole lot of published data from our country in particular. We've seen some papers come out using US data looking at forward-facing versus rear-facing car seats in general, but they don't really break it down all the way into specific types of crashes. So we're looking for kids specifically rear-facing and rear impacts. So we don't have that data from the US right now, but what we do have from other countries shows that rear impacts appear to be low risk for children, even those in rear-facing car seats. However, as I mentioned, these sample sizes are really small, and in order for the stats to really be strong, we would love to have a larger data size. But when we don't have data that we can look at, we like to make our own. So this was a project that was completed over the past, I think about 2 years ago now, where we did some crash testing, some sled testing of our own to investigate this scenario. So what we did was take a modern year vehicle sedan seat, and you can see it there. The blue frame of the seat is what attaches the vehicle seat cushions to the sled fixture, to our crash test fixture, and the vehicle seat back and the vehicle seat pan. So both of those cushions that you see there were replaced after every sled test. So we didn't have to worry about any of the cushions kind of being matted down test after test. We examined 4 different CRS models in our SLED testing. You can see here we had 2 infant carriers, which are on the top, and 2 convertible seats in their rear-facing mode across the bottom. I'm not going to show you every single test that we did, but just to let you know, that was kind of our layout, that we had 4 different CRS models in the same sedan seat that you see there, the same model of sedan seat, but changing out the cushions every time, and of course changing out the CRS every time, because we know after the CRS has been in a crash, it may no longer be structurally intact for another crash. So we replace that after every test as well. The first test I'm going to show is one of the infant carriers. So I want to just kind of orient you to this before I play the video. We have our rear-facing infant carrier installed in the vehicle seat. We've got it installed with the lower anchors using the base. For this particular seat, we have a 12-month-old infant in it. You can see that this infant is pretty close to outgrowing this rear-facing carrier. The top of the head, it looks like it might be close to within an inch from the top of the carrier. So this is actually a 12-month-old crash test dummy, a size representative of a 12-month-old. So we're kind of reaching the upper limit of size that we would put in this car seat. We've got the carry handle in this particular case in the stowed position. So we've got that handle pushed back behind the head of the occupant. And when I play this video, the impact is going to come from behind. So again, this is a rear impact. So this would be simulating like a car coming in from the rear of the vehicle and impacting from behind. So when I play this, as we might expect, the occupant moves towards the rear of the vehicle, and you see that rotation of the child seat and the occupant rotate upward. So we actually draw with chalk on the dummy's face so that we can tell where the dummy made contact. You can see that there was some slight contact on the head restraint. We've got a red chalk mark there. I'll play it again. I want you to notice that as the seat is rotating, it interacts quite a bit with the vehicle seat cushion down near the child's feet. And that interaction really slows the rotation pretty well. So we don't see this child hitting the head very hard against the vehicle head restraint, but we see kind of that rotational motion, and the CRS kind of digs in to the seat cushion and helps to slow that rotation so that the head just kind of makes minor contact with the vehicle seat head restraint. We're going to look at the same seat, this time with the carry handle upright. So the same seat model, again, it's a different CRS. It was swapped out for a new one, but the exact same model, exact same crash dummy, 12-month-old occupant, and this time with the carry handle upright. And if we play this, now you see, again, similar movement. You see the carry handle interact with the vehicle seat back and with the head restraint in particular. And that carry handle kind of helps to slow and stop the rotation of the car seat. But if you look closely, you can see the head of the crash test dummy just barely brushes against the underside of that carry handle. And again, this is in slow motion, so you know it happened faster in real life. But we did have that chalk mark there, so we know it made contact. And I want to note in particular that this carry handle position is not typically allowed by this manufacturer. So they have done these tests, you know, they are aware that the head might hit the underside, and so they do not allow the carry handle in this position during vehicle travel. So again, as CPSTs, we know that the rules vary by manufacturer. Some manufacturers do allow this upright carry handle position during travel. That is because they have done their own testing. They have determined that for their particular seat, it's not a factor. For example, I forget if I included this video, but for a different type of seat, that carry handle is curved more, and it kind of comes up further around the child's head, and the child's head is not in danger of touching that handle. So it depends how the handle is shaped. It depends exactly, you know, the angle that handle is at. So of course, always follow manufacturer instructions. We got special permission from the manufacturer to test in this mode. So now we have a very obvious visual of why that manufacturer did not want that carry handle upright for this particular occupant. And then moving on, here is, again, the same CRS model swapped out for a new one. This time we have it installed with the seat belt without the base. So we have a typical 3-point seat belt coming across here and no base. And if we play this time, we see very different movements. We see the occupant kind of pulls forward and then the CRS rotates, but it doesn't really interact with that vehicle seat back anymore. It's kind of interacting more with the bottom seat cushion on the vehicle. And I'll play this a few more times, but we see very different movements for when this carrier is installed without the base. One thing to note, though, is that the head doesn't make contact against anything in this scenario. The occupant does pull forward kind of out of the shell, but there is no head contact against the seat back. We see the neck bend forward, so we do see some of that neck flexion. So this is where the sensors in the crash test dummy are really going to tell us a lot of information. So to review those three scenarios, again, same CRS model tested with a carry handle stowed behind the occupant's head, with the carry handle upright in the middle, and then with the no base condition on the right. We did see head contact in those first two scenarios against either the vehicle head restraint or the underside of the carry handle, but the sensors in the dummy's head told us that that head contact was very minor. So to measure the severity of head contact, we look at something called HIC, which stands for Head Injury Criterion, and the one we're looking at here is called HIC 15 because it's looking at the acceleration over a 15 millisecond period. It's a whole big fancy calculation. Basically, the bottom line is that the injury threshold is 389, and our trials came up to 39 and 62. So we are very far under that injury threshold for head injury, which is great news. So what that tells us is that even though, visually that occupant's head made contact with the head restraint, we don't appear to be anywhere near the injurious range for this particular 12-month-old occupant. Will that differ based on, what that vehicle head restraint looks like? Yes, it might. The ones we have here in this testing series are very large, they're very soft, they're very cushy. Not every head restraint looks like that. So we might get different results if we used a different vehicle seat with a different head restraint. So those are all limitations to keep in mind. Of course, we can never test every single scenario out there. But for this particular scenario, we have really very little to no evidence of head injury here. I want to talk briefly about neck tension, especially considering the last trial where we didn't have the base attached and you really kind of saw the head pull forward. The neck tension in this scenario was very similar to the other trials. So visually it looked a little bit worse. We saw a little bit more neck load in some directions compared to others. And I mean, forward versus to the side versus twisting motion. But overall, we didn't really see any increased evidence of neck injury in that no base scenario. So the purpose of kind of showing these freeze frames is to show you that in the first two scenarios with the base, which is typically the most common installation we see, the CRS rotated towards the rear of the vehicle, towards the point of impact, but the occupant stayed contained within the CRS very well. So we don't really see the 5-point harness doing a whole lot in that scenario. The head, neck, and spine stay pretty aligned. We wouldn't see really any evidence of head or neck injury in that CRS is really able to do its job in kind of rotating with the occupant, gradually bringing the occupant to a stop by interacting with the vehicle seat back itself. And then even with the no base condition where we didn't have quite as much of that interaction helping to slow down the rotation, we still didn't really see evidence of increased risk of injury there. Okay, I want to move on to the next type of rear-facing infant seat. So this time, you can tell we've got a different model of car seat here. We've got the same 12-month-old occupant inside, and we've got the handle stowed behind the occupant. So when this one goes through its impact, again, we see very similar movements. We see the base of the CRS interacting really nicely with the vehicle seat. And this time, we don't have any head contact. So you see that this CRS is actually able to stop that rotation before the head contacts, and then the occupant kind of falls back into place. Again, we don't really see the neck straining forward very much. We see the shell kind of moving with the occupant. And we don't really see the head flex forward until after the event is over, as that seat rotates back down to its starting position. Next, we've got the same CRS model, this time with an anti-rebound bar. And I know it's difficult to see. The anti-rebound bar is black, and this time our vehicle seat back is black as well. but that anti-rebound bar is right here. And we're going to see how that anti-rebound bar, it helps stabilize the CRS a little bit. And you can see we don't have quite as much rotation as we did in the last one, but overall the movements are pretty similar. The CRS still rotates with the occupant a little bit, kind of slowly bringing that occupant to a stop as the CRS interacts with the vehicle seat back. And it's a little bit easier to see side by side. So on the left, we have that case where the handle is stowed behind the occupant's head. On the right, we have the anti-rebound bar. You can see that the anti-rebound bar did kind of stop that rotation a little bit. And as we look through all of our sensors on the crash test dummy for these scenarios, we didn't really see any evidence of injury. We had, again, very low head injury criteria, very low HIC values between 32 to 38, again, compared to that threshold, which is almost 400. And our chest acceleration was also low. It was about half of what the injury threshold was, which would be considered very safe. Next, I want to look at a slightly older child in a convertible seat rear facing. So this time we have a 3-year-old crash test dummy, so representing the average 3-year-old. We have a rear facing convertible seat. As I play this, you'll notice that the knees are going to hyperextend. That's not what would happen to an actual child. The crash test dummy just isn't flexible enough to kind of fold his legs or sit crisscross style or move his legs in any other position other than straight out like this. So in order to make sure that these feet weren't impeding any movement, we took the stoppers out of the knee. So you're going to see those knees bend in the wrong direction. It's going to look really painful, but I promise it's just a limitation of the crash test dummy. It's not what would happen to an actual child. So again, I want you to focus when I play this. Here we go. On the CRS interacting with the vehicle seat back, the child staying relatively aligned. You see the head tilt forward slightly, but for the most part, that CRS rotates with the child and helps to keep the head protected. The head doesn't contact the head restraint, and you don't really see any strong forces pulling on the neck. And I want you to compare to, now we have the same CRS model, but this time we have a Swedish-style tether. So a Swedish-style tether goes, it's kind of difficult to see here through all the cables, but it connects to the back of the CRS and then attaches to the floor of the vehicle in front of the occupant, or kind of behind the occupant's head. So the purpose of this tether would be to prohibit the rotational motion that we've been seeing. So when we play this video, we see that the tether does its job very well. It stops the rotation of that child's seat. But now we see kind of a trade-off where that 5-point harness is doing a lot more work because the harness is now restraining the torso pretty quickly. And we see the head continue to move forward. So now we're seeing those kinematics that we're seeing those movements that we might be expecting to see more in a frontal impact in a forward-facing seat, where we see the 5-point harness really doing a lot of work and potentially putting some strain on that neck, which of course we would not particularly want for a young rear-facing child. So if we look at the freeze frame side by side, again, the no tether condition on the left and the Swedish-style tether on the right, the tethered condition had higher neck tension, neck shear, and neck extension moments. So again, those are just loads in all different directions. They were still below the injury thresholds for the 3-year-old, but again, the 3-year-old is stronger than what we might see in like a newborn or something like that. So we were still below those injury thresholds, but they were starting to get a little bit higher. We saw slightly higher head injury criteria and chest resultant acceleration. They were still very far below the thresholds, but again, in these cases, we're not really riding down those forces, those crash forces quite as much. We're really stopping that rotation very quickly, which in some cases is necessary, but compared to this other condition where we had the no tether and we kind of allowed that CRS to interact with the vehicle seat, we tended to see slightly lower injury numbers there. So I guess the bottom line here is that Swedish-style tethers, they don't appear to cause injuries in the sense that, we didn't see any of our sensors. None of them told us that, like, yes, this would definitely cause an injury. Our numbers were still below the injury threshold, so we would still expect this crash test dummy to come out of this crash condition without injuries. But the tether didn't really seem to be particularly necessary. So the same seat without the tether performed very well, performed maybe even a little bit better in this particular scenario. So we need to remember that, this crash testing that we're looking at, it's one type of impact. It's a rear impact at one speed with one occupant. So there's all kinds of different crash scenarios out there. If a manufacturer says use the top tether, that means they have determined that that tether is beneficial overall. And I'm talking rear facing here. In this country, we don't really see the rear facing car seats using the top tether quite as often anymore. Some manufacturers have kind of phased out the rear facing tether. But for what it's worth, these are what the numbers show for this particular rear impact. Again, always listen to the manufacturer. They have done a lot more testing scenarios than we've done here. We just kind of wanted to put together kind of a visual to show what's going on here. And of course, that was just for rear facing. So for forward facing, always use the top tether. And we'll get to that here in our third objective. So having seen all those videos now, hopefully I kind of made some sense of what was going on there. But how do we as CPSTs communicate this information with caregivers? So presumably if you're if you're curbside doing a seat check and a caregiver asks about a rear facing seat and a rear impact, it'd be great if you could pull out your phone and show them a video, but typically we don't have that kind of time or resources. So how do we explain what's happening to a caregiver? What's the 2-minute summary here? So here's kind of the question that started this all. So if a child is rear facing and you get hit from behind, isn't that the same as a forward facing child in a frontal crash? So again, it's a question we get a lot. First off, it's a really great question. I love it when parents ask this. I love it when CPSTs ask this. It shows that they're thinking about crash forces. It shows they're thinking about physics and where things are coming from. So it's really good. It's definitely to be encouraged. However, it's important that we communicate that no, these scenarios are not the same. As we just saw, a rear-facing CRS has ways to interact with the vehicle seat to absorb crash forces, whereas forward-facing CRSs rely primarily on the 5-point harness to restrain the occupant. So I'm going to show, so here's kind of a picture of what's going on there. So this is an example of a forward-facing car seat and a frontal impact. We can see that the 5-point harness has to interact with the occupant, and the 5-point harness does a great job of restraining the torso. However, that kind of allows the head to continue forward. So this can cause some increased neck forces, which we talk about a lot. We talk a lot about how infants and children in their first couple years of life, the neck isn't developed enough to handle these forces. As the child gets older and more developed, then their neck is able to handle this. And so the scenario that you see on your screen isn't inherently bad as long as the child is old enough and developed enough to handle those forces. It's important that that forward-facing car seat is harnessed very tightly and is tethered very tightly, because in this case, we want the child to stop moving as quickly as possible. We don't want any rotation. We don't want any slack in that harness that's going to allow the child to slowly ride down the forces, because the more slowly we allow the forward-facing child to ride down forces, the higher risk they have of hitting their head on something inside the vehicle. So we don't really have the luxury of slowly bringing that forward-facing child to a stop, because then they might hit their heads. You're kind of allowing more time for them to move out of the safety of that shell. So for a forward-facing seat, it's very, very important to be tightly tethered, to be tightly buckled, and to stop that movement as quickly as possible to reduce the head excursion. However, for a rear-facing seat, we've got a few more options here. We've got the car seat, the CRS interacting with the vehicle seat. We've got those cushions there. We've got the head restraint, and we've got a little bit more time as that CRS rotates rearward, where the torso can engage more slowly with the harness and help to keep the head aligned. And so that's really what's going to help protect these infants' vulnerable necks, vulnerable spines, and vulnerable heads from getting hurt, because they can kind of have that luxury of a little bit more time and space to kind of slowly come to a stop as that CRS rotates. So that's kind of the bottom line there. In conclusion, rear-facing CRS have features to absorb forces in rear impacts. It's important to note that these data we went through today are not sufficient to conclude whether a rear-facing or forward-facing CRS is safer in a rear impact scenario. Again, we didn't look at forward-facing in rear impacts at all, if you can keep up with all the different combinations we've got here. But we would really need a lot more stats of real kids and real crashes to determine, which type of seat is safer and which type of impact. So what we did here today was just take a closer look at one particular scenario, see exactly what's going on with the physics, see exactly what's going on with the dummy, so that we can explain and kind of understand and teach parents and caregivers exactly what's going on there, to teach them that, it's not necessarily a scenario that they have to worry about. So ultimately, these conclusions today align with the best practice recommendations to keep kids rear-facing for as long as possible. More information is available. We recently published all of these data in a journal from SAE International. The title of it is there. I'm the main author, and it's called Rear-Facing Child Restraint Systems in Rear Impact Sled Tests. Okay, so hopefully that covers rear impacts, probably more than anybody ever wanted to know. Lastly, with just the last few minutes that we have here, I want to touch briefly on child safety and side impacts. So as we talked about in that first slide, looking at the pie chart, we know that side impacts account for about 20% of impacts that happen, but they tend to cause a disproportionately high number of injuries. And there's a couple of different reasons for that we're going to talk about. And it has a lot to do with the seating position, or it has some to do with the seating position, I should say. So we're going to kind of switch gears, talk less about rear-facing versus forward-facing car seats, CRSs that is, and we're going to talk a little bit about seating position here. So the objective of this section is to understand how a CPST can help a caregiver choose the best seating position for their child. We're going to think about, what exactly do we mean by best, and are there other good or better options, and what other factors do we need to consider? Because when we are curbside and we're trying to decide, which seating position a child should sit in, there are many, many factors to consider, and we're going to talk about some of them here. So first, some terminology when we're talking about side impact. When we talk about a near side impact, that means that the occupant of interest, the occupant that we're focusing on, is seated directly next to the door that is impacted. So in this scenario here, we might have another vehicle coming in where you see that blue arrow, and they're impacting a vehicle with an occupant seated right here next to the door that's being impacted. So that's a near side impact. If we talk about a far side impact, that means that the occupant is not directly next to the door, but on the opposite door. So now we've got the occupant, we've got some space in between, and then we've got the striking vehicle coming in from the far side. And then what we learn in CPST class is that the center seating position is a convenient way to keep the occupant away from both doors. So now if you have a occupant seated in that center position right in the middle, you don't really have a near side or a far side scenario, regardless of what side the vehicle gets struck on. You've got a little bit of space on both sides of the occupant, kind of keeping them away from both doors in a side impact. So we learn in CPST class that that center position might offer a little bit more protection against a child being hurt in a side impact. Again, you're kind of hedging your bets. If we look back in these scenarios, the safest place to be in a side impact is on the far side. But of course, we don't know what side our vehicle is going to get hit on. So if you sit on one side or the other, the center position is kind of a way to hedge your bets, I guess, to kind of keep the occupant away from both doors, regardless of what side you get hit on. So one of the supporting studies to support that is by Callan et al., 2008. They looked at children ages 0 to 3 years old, and they looked at insurance claim records in a phone survey, and they calculated injury risk as a percentage of the population that was involved in crashes. So what they found is that if you had a child of this age seated on the left outboard position in a crash, they had a 0.27% chance of injury. on the right outboard was very similar, 0.29% chance of injury. And in the center position, that percent of injury goes down to 0.17. So you should look across here and see that, these are very small chances of injuries. So across all positions, we're seeing that car seats are doing a really good job of protecting kids. The center position is a little bit better. If you want to take those numbers and kind of crunch them one way, you can say that the center position has a 43% lower injury risk than the outboard position. So, that sounds significant when you say 43% lower. But again, there's so few children getting hurt in these scenarios that, you need to keep in mind that these outboard positions still have very low injury risk. So another way to look at this is to say that all positions showed less than 5 injuries per 1,000 children, which is really, really good. I guess the purpose of this slide is just to kind of remind everyone that, yes, the center position is shown to offer a little bit of benefit compared to those outboard positions, but the outboard positions still do really well. And the authors of this paper do go ahead and state exactly that in their paper. They say these data do not indicate the outboard position is a poor choice, but rather, given available space and ability to obtain a tight installation, the center position allows for further reductions in injury risk beyond the already excellent protection afforded by CRSs attached in the outboard positions. So this is kind of where that guideline comes from. And I think it's always good to remind technicians of exactly what those percentages are and exactly, how much of a difference we're talking. So absolutely, all things being equal, if that center position is available, if that caregiver is able to use that center position and get a tight installation there, sure, go ahead and use it. But definitely, if those outboard positions offer a better solution for whatever reason for that family, as long as you can get a good installation there, they're still really good choices. There's another study that supports this, Howard et al., 2004. They found that the near side position does result in slightly more injuries, 7 injuries per 1,000, where the center has 2 injuries per 1,000 and far side 1 injury per 1,000. So again, you don't really know what the near side and what the far side is going to be until after the crash already happens. But according to their data, the center position does offer pretty good protection regardless of side being struck. There's also some opposing literature. So again, I just want to kind of drive home that this isn't really a cut and dry rule. It depends on a lot of things. So a study in 2005 found no significant differences among all rear row positions. They found injury risk from about 0.12% to 0.14% across all positions, again, which is still very low, shows that CRSs are doing their job pretty well. And then another study by Maltese et al. Found that for older kids, the center and near side position performed similarly, and that kids benefited in the far side position only. So a lot of those studies that support the center position were more aimed towards the 0 to 3-year-old range. But this study is saying, well, as kids get older, as they get taller, as their legs get longer, that center position might still not be far enough away from the intruding door. And really, we don't see the benefit until the child is all the way in the far side position where we see the reduction in injury. And again, you don't really know what side is going to be the far side until after the crash already happens. So there are, of course, some challenges with the center position. I'll go through these quickly because we're coming to the end here, and most of us are familiar with these as CPSTs. If that center position is available and you can get a car seat installed in there, that's fantastic. But we know that the center position seat belts tend to be a little bit narrower than the outboard. We know that center position latch is not always available. The CRS can interfere with the front row seat. And in this condition, if you've got it in the middle, you've got to kind of contend with both the left and the right front row seat as opposed to just one or the other if you choose a side. It can be difficult for caregivers to reach the center, especially in large vehicles. So if you've got a short caregiver in a very large, tall vehicle, they might not be able to reach the center to buckle their child in. And of course, the scenario where we have 2 rear seat passengers, they tend to fit best in the 2 outboard positions. So we wanted to kind of go through this to kind of remind you that, yes, the center position is statistically your best choice, but it's a small difference. And the outboard positions are not inherently bad choices. And as always, the safest position is wherever the caregiver can get a good installation and use the CRS correctly during every single ride. So that concludes my slides. I want to give a quick acknowledgement to the NSF Center for Child Injury Prevention Studies, who funded this work, especially the crash testing. Thank you to the industry members from our group. This group is really unique because we have a lot of the major car companies, a lot of the major car seat manufacturers are all involved in this research. They not only fund the research, but they also act as mentors. So we can kind of bounce ideas off of engineers and all of those groups as we're going through and collecting these data and making sure that we're collecting data that's very valuable to the industry. Here's my last slide. I think we can leave it on here for a minute. It's just my contact info, my email address. If you have any questions, we are going to open it up to questions here, but if you have any follow-up thoughts, you can always reach out to me via email, julie.mansfield@osumc.edu. The next link is for the center that I work at OSU, the Injury Biomechanics Research Center. We do a lot of research. It's not just child research here. A lot of my colleagues are working on really interesting adult occupant protection strategies as well. The next is the Center for Child Injury Prevention Studies, or CCHIPS. This is where you can read about all of our child-related research and some of the industry groups that fund it. And then lastly is our Buckle Up with Brutus link. It's our caregiver-oriented website that we developed here at OSU. So we wanted to have, OSU has a giant medical center. Lots of babies are born here every day, and we wanted to have kind of an in-house reference for parents to go to so that they could learn about car safety. So we developed our Buckle Up with Brutus program. We've got a cute little baby Brutus in a car seat. So if you're interested in checking that out, feel free to check it out. I always like to say I'm always very, very open to feedback. If you have any questions about what was presented today, if you have any research ideas, we're always looking for ideas for new projects. So if you have a question that you think needs some data to support it, or something that comes up often in the field in conversations with caregivers, please reach out and let me know. We're working on gathering up new ideas for a new research year. This study I presented today came out of, caregivers ask me this question a lot. Maybe we should do some crash testing, collect some data, record some video so that we can better understand and better explain what's happening. So we're always open to feedback here. Feel free to reach out. And thank you very much for your time today. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Julie. There are two questions that appear in the question section, and the first one happened about halfway through as you were showing the videos. At what speed were these impacts in the sled test, I think is what's implied.
Great question. Yeah, we used, I believe it was right around 29 miles per hour impact. There is a frontal impact sled test in the United States. The certification, the test that the car seats have to pass in frontal is about 29 to 30 miles per hour. And there is a rear impact sled speed that car seats in Europe have to pass, but is actually not implemented here in the United States. So we took some insight from that European standard, some insight from our own frontal standard, and also some insight from our side impact standard, which is currently being developed, and along with some other concurrent work that was done within our group. And we landed on about, I believe it was 29 to 30 miles per hour impact. There's more information in the paper about the exact accelerations that we used, but I believe that was actually, I have a slide on that. Let me pull it up instead of guessing at wrong information. Here we go. So this was the sled pulse that we used. This is in acceleration, so in G's. So we were just about at 18, oh, I'm sorry, it was 18 miles per hour. I'm getting my test confused. 18 miles per hour, peak G's of 17.5. So in terms of rear impact, this would be about an 80th percentile in terms of rear impact severity. So about 80% of rear impacts happen near this speed or below. So it's not the absolute most severe rear impact we might expect to see, but it's 80th percentile. So it's a moderate to severe rear impact, 18 miles per hour. Sorry about that.
Okay, great, thank you. 4 questions. I'm going to try to put these in order. Have there been repeated studies on the Callahan study since 2008?
I am not aware of any. I did do that literature review fairly recently, within the last 6 months or so. I don't think I was able to find anything more recent. This was the largest that I could find. There might have been 1 or 2 smaller ones to kind of follow up on that. I can get back to you if that person wants to email. But this was kind of the strongest study I was able to find. That's not to say that it doesn't exist. I'm not promising I left every stone unturned, but this is the study that most recommendations are based on.
Thank you. There's a question that asked, are the videos that were shown of the rear impact sled testing on all 4 child restraint models available on YouTube? And I, as the moderator, am going to add, or on your website?
We do not have those up yet. It is our goal to create a kind of caregiver-friendly version of those videos. We have to be careful with that because of our funders have to approve of everything, and we need to make sure that our messaging is very clear. We definitely don't want to use scare tactics for caregivers who might not understand what they're watching. So it is on our to-do list to get these videos formatted and in a presentation that we could post on YouTube, but we have not gotten there yet. Hopefully within the next 6 months or so, we might be able to get that out.
Okay. Another question that has come up with each of these webinars is, are the slides available? And I will answer from the Child Passenger Safety Project here at MIMS. Each of these webinars is archived into a movie platform and then is posted on our MIMS Child Passenger Safety website that we will end the discussion on. I want to make sure we've answered all the questions with Julie's slides still available. And we will also cross-post that on YouTube. It will be a locked movie so that it can be watched in full for continuing education. So if you wanted to share this with colleagues who could then fill out the evaluation and watching it retrospectively receive child passenger safety education training credits, that is possible. We do not release the individual slide sets because they belong to the author. So Julie, I will defer to you to answer access to specific slides.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that would be great. If we can post the whole presentation together, that's fine within context. I have no problem with that. But yeah, we need to be careful about letting the crash videos just float around by themselves without any explanation. Would be the only thing I'd be concerned about. But yeah, we can definitely post the presentation in full. That's fine.
Okay. And then we have a question from the chat box, which says, can you comment on the reevaluation of the old study that produced the original American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation to keep children rear-facing until 2 years of age?
Sure. So I was not directly involved in that. So I don't want to overstep my bounds here. And I probably, to be honest, don't know a whole lot more about it than you know. This question seems to be pretty informed. I know that the original study that came out in, I think, 2007, 2008, the Henry et al. Study, there was an error in the stats. That study stated that rear-facing is 5 times safer. That particular statistic and catchphrase has been reevaluated. The stats have been rerun and resubmitted. The name escapes me right now. The new lead author on the study that came out within the last year or two. Basically what they found, looking at US data from NHTSA, they were not able to find a statistically significant sample size. And I'm not a statistician, and I'm not going to get too far into the details of what statistically significant means because I would not do justice in explaining it. One of the major problems was that the sample size just wasn't large enough. So there was kind of some trending evidence that rear-facing children suffered fewer injuries or less severe injuries than forward-facing, but the number of children getting hurt was so small that it was difficult to conclude either way from these data. So with that in mind, the authors reevaluated the data that we do have. They looked at data from other countries, such as Sweden and Germany, that I touched on today. Basically, some of the stats were reevaluated, but the bottom line recommendation still stands. Experts in the field agree rear-facing until at least age 2. The AAP has not revised their official best practice recommendations, as far as I know. So that's definitely still the advice we want to give to parents.